Today we are talking about 3 significant risks for unmarried couples in retirement. Let's get going. Over the last year, I found myself working with 3 separate retirement age couples who are in long-standing relationships but not legally married. As a result, I've had to think about and do some additional research to identify risks that are unique to these situations. Now, one thing I want to add is this video is not about whether people should get married or not. In the real world cases that I'm working on with the 3 unmarried couples, most of these folks were previously married, have kids from prior relationships, and so forth. And my point is, life is complicated, and there could be real practical reasons for not legally marrying, or at least not yet. But that being said, what this video is about is helping people understand that the status of marriage provides spouses a number of special protections and rights and preferential treatment in the tax code that unmarried couples do not have. In fact, one of the articles I read in preparation of this video suggested there are over 1,000 laws on the books at the federal level which provide some type of additional benefits or protections to members of a married couple. But the reason I'm creating this video here today is what I've learned is for couples that are not married, they don't realize that they do not have these benefits or protections in most cases until someone dies. In fact, I spoke to 3 separate estate planning attorneys during my research, and all of them shared with me really sad stories of a surviving partner in a couple basically kind of being left out and, in an unideal situation that could have been resolved or at least planned for and hedged against had they done some proactive planning. So that's what we're talking about today. We don't have time to go through 1,000 laws, but I'm going to hit on 3 things specifically. We're going to talk about Social Security benefits, we're going to talk about inherited IRAs, and we're going to talk about the issues with real estate. Let's start with Social Security survivor benefits. The way it works for married couples, if one spouse is to die, the other spouse gets to keep the larger of the 2 Social Security benefits as a survivor benefit, but they don't get to keep both. So as an example, I always think of my mom and dad. They had a very classic marriage where my mother stayed at home for a big chunk of her career, raising kids, and my dad was out working, being the breadwinner. So his benefit is substantially larger than my mother's. If my dad were to predecease my mom her Social Security benefit would go away, but she would collect his much larger benefit for the remainder of her life. That's how Social Security survivor benefits work for married couples. But if you're not married, the most important thing to remember on this point is you are not eligible for a Social Security survivor benefit. So this could be a real risk in situations where there's a major difference in the amounts of Social Security benefits that 2 people are bringing in. Obviously, the big risk is if the person with the much larger benefit were to die, that Social Security benefit would be lost, potentially leaving the surviving member of a couple in a financial bind if they were relying on those combined Social Security benefits for the majority of their retirement income. So if you're in a situation where you're in a long-term relationship but you have no intention of marrying, you need to be planning for the potential loss of that larger benefit. You got to make sure that the surviving member of this couple is going to be okay living off the smaller of those 2 Social Security checks. The next thing I want to talk about here is the less favorable treatment of inherited IRAs for non-spouses. So the way it works for married couples, if your spouse dies and you inherit their IRA, so let's just use my mom and dad for example. If my dad were to die and my mother inherited his IRA, she would inherit that IRA and be able to treat it as if it were hers all along. She would be afforded all the same flexibility that people that own individual retirement accounts have. Now, to compare that, in contrast, if you inherit an IRA as a non-spouse, so even if this comes from, whether it's from your significant other or a parent or a grandparent, you're subject to a much stricter set of rules. And most notably, you have a very compressed timeline from which you have to take distribution from these accounts. and specifically it's a 10-year window. So this can be a significant problem, especially with larger IRAs. Think like a 7-figure IRA that all must be drawn down within 10 years. Most IRAs are comprised of pre-tax dollars. Of course, there's some exceptions, but by and large, that's typically what we see. And what that means is when that money comes out, it's fully taxable. So if you inherit a significant or a large IRA as a non-spouse, per the 10-year rule, your income is going up whether you want it to or not. And some people might think this is a good problem to have, but again, depending on your situation, this could push your income up significantly when you don't even want it to, and you might end up having to pay a very unfavorable tax rate in comparison to if you inherit an IRA as a spouse, whereas you would have potentially the rest of your life to draw that down and be much more strategic in your planning and so forth, and pay a better effective tax rate over time. So the rules here simply are much less favorable to folks who are non-spouses, and people need to be planning for this, particularly with larger inherited IRAs. Earlier I mentioned I spoke to 3 separate estate planning attorneys during my research for these real-world cases I was working on, and also, in preparation for this video. Without question, all 3 of these folks basically shared with me that the biggest issue that arises with unmarried couples that are retirement age usually has to do with real estate. Those are typically where the disputes and potentially unpleasant surprises arise. And the reason is, oftentimes what happens with folks that, enter a relationship later in life, they'll usually end up consolidating into one household, but it's typically into a home that one of them already owned previously. The issue is, of course, what happens when that homeowner ultimately dies? Frankly, these are the situations where I heard the most really sad stories, because basically the way the laws are written, in circumstances where an individual owns a home and that individual dies, let's assume that they didn't do any estate planning, the ownership of that property is going to their family. That's typically how the intestacy clauses rules, not to throw any jargon at you, but that's kind of the default template that states use to determine the distribution of assets for someone who has not done an estate plan. The problem with this, of course, is if there's a surviving member of a couple actually living in this house, they're going to be left at the mercy of whatever family member it is that ultimately takes control. And as I alluded to earlier, I was told some pretty heartbreaking stories of where, some cold-hearted person who did not care about this relationship basically told that person goodbye. We're selling the home. So my point is, if you are in an unmarried relationship where you're living together with someone, it is absolutely imperative that you do your estate planning to basically plan for what happens when the owner of that property ultimately dies. Is the survivor going to either inherit that property or have some type of rights to remain living there for some period of time? There's lots of things that need to be taken into account. A simple approach obviously would be to become joint owners of a property, but that brings up possible issues if there's children from prior marriages. Could one side of the tree be disinherited potentially? So there's a lot of issues here, which makes estate planning, when it comes to real estate, absolutely crucial. All right, to conclude this discussion, again, I want to emphasize the message is not everybody needs to rush out and get married. The message here is to understand that the laws, by default, simply do not provide protection and rights to people who may be couples but are not legally married. That is the key point to understand. And I think a great place to start for most couples in these situations is you need to first have a conversation between the two of you. Frankly, I think that is probably one of the biggest sticking points for people, is just getting that dialogue going. But beyond that, as we've discussed, I think it's pretty clear, Planning is absolutely critical, particularly when it comes to things like transferring assets, specifically investments, and as we talked about at the end, real estate. So make sure you're working with a good financial professional to ensure the retirement plan works should one of the partners within a couple pass away. Retirement planning is my specialty, so if you have any questions or if you're interested in having a conversation, check out my website. I'll leave a link in the description if you're watching on YouTube, or in the comment section if you're on one of the other platforms. Please feel free to reach out to me. As always, thanks for watching. I hope we'll see you in the next one.